out and chew on this, a few other things. We are power packed. Charlie Hurt, co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend, Caroline Downey, National Review columnist, and Tommy Lahren, co-host of the Big Weekend Show on Fox News. And it is delightful. Thanks to all of you for coming. Tommy, let me just begin with you. It's not personal. I never do anything personal. But I'm baffled and concerned, and I guess very critical of what JD Vance has been saying and doing and even not doing, to Kim Strassel's point. He's not leading the administration up on the Hill in the Senate. But these other statements, where are they coming from? What is this all about?
Yeah, I didn't think that the Joe Rogan podcast was exceptionally helpful to the White House, to the president's mission here, to the overall mission. I found it rather perplexing. I don't know if JD is trying to differentiate himself from the Trump doctrine. I don't know if he's positioning himself in 2028 to be the leader of maybe what might be a more America First, isolationist wing of MAGA. Maybe he is. But I don't think President Trump is going to like that too much. Now, I don't know if they okayed him doing that podcast. I don't know what those discussions were like. I don't claim to know.
He doesn't seem to be, to your other point, he doesn't seem to be in sync with presidential policy. And I got to tell you, I've worked in 2 administrations, and that's your job. The president's the guy elected, and if you don't like it, you'll leave. But if you stay, you have to follow his policies. He's not doing that in this. JD Vance. He's not following Trump's policies.
And I'm sure they have a lot to say on this as well. I will just end with this. 2028, we know there's been a lot of discussions about Rubio and Vance. I don't think Vance is helping himself out here. If he wants to distance himself from President Trump, do it at your own peril.
Caroline, a lot of this concerns me. But, okay, if you don't like free market economics, I've only spent 50-some-odd years defending it, but whatever. Not everyone agrees with me. I understand that perfectly well. But the thing that really troubles me is, as the New York Post put it, flirting with anti-Semitism, blaming Israel, which he has done several times. As Tommy suggested, with Joe Rogan, that was probably the worst example of it, but that's not the first time he's talked about that. Israel, by the by, did not break the deal. Iran broke the deal. Was the deal fabulous? We could argue about the deal till we were blue in the face. But the point is, Israel had nothing to do with ending the deal. This criticism of Israel, which J.D. Vance has made several times, is very, very concerning. They are our ally. They are perhaps our best friend in the world. They are very valuable in technology and intelligence. But we don't cotton to anti-Semitism. That kind of hate and bigotry spreads everywhere. Jews today, Catholics tomorrow, blacks the next day. We've been through all that. Why is he even touching that, fifth rail?
Because to Ben Dominich's point, he is a little too prone to the noise online, to the algorithms, to all of these fringes and anonymous accounts and bots, and all they're doing is perpetuating this narrative that Israel is the boogeyman, which just doesn't comport with reality. This idea that President Trump, which JD Vance did kind of flirt with this idea that Trump is captured and his decision-making has been captured by foreign interests. That's a pretty serious accusation. If you believe that, that should have been litigated privately, not in public on a podcast, number one. But number two, it's just not true. 1% or less of our defense budget goes toward Israel defense and military aid. They're not taking our country hostage. They're not dictating the terms of this war. And to your point, Larry, I mean, Iran has broken every single peace treaty it has signed. How is that Israel's fault? That's Iran's fault.
I mean, that's exactly right. And Charlie, the other area of this business, he attacked Friedman, he attacked Thatcher, he attacked meritocracy. I don't know which is worse. They're all pretty bad in my judgment. But meritocracy, look, Donald Trump has done brilliant, wonderful things to try to end all the DEI that was created by Obama and by Biden and their minions, okay? What is DEI? It's affirmative action on steroids, okay? It's race, gender, and so forth. We've done everything we can, and we want to promote. You can hear Donald Trump anytime you want, speech after speech, off-the-cuff remarks. He loves meritocracy. He loves smart people who succeed. Now, why in the world would J.D. Vance decide to produce some kind of fifth column? No, meritocracy is too bad. People making money is not good. Milton Friedman is to blame. Margaret Thatcher is a problem. He's sending signals that are completely counter to what the president is doing, but to what the Declaration of Independence argues, for heaven's sake. We just celebrated the 250th anniversary.
One of the greatest things I've done was this year for Lent, I gave up listening to podcasts for the rest of my life. And it's been a real time saver. It's been wonderful. I don't have to listen to these things and then spend another 20 hours debunking all of these things. So I missed a lot of what JD Vance said about all that. But the president has been very clear about what happened with this memo of understanding. And if you talk to him, he's happy to tell you, he'll tell anybody, it's the Iranians. And he goes ballistic about the Iranians and how impossible it is to deal with them. And one of the stupidest things, and I see some of it online, because I still do go on the internet every now and then. When you go on the internet, you see a lot of this business about how, and by the way, I think we should all be careful about assuming anti-Semitism, because I don't think that certainly nobody that I know who has legitimate disagreements with Israel is anti-Semitic. But usually that is used to shut down a debate. On the other side, the thing that's used to shut down debate is this business about, oh, they're co-opted, he's been bought off. If you think that Donald Trump is being bullied by Benjamin Netanyahu or anybody in the world into doing something he doesn't want to do, you're bonkers. You've lost your mind. You don't understand the guy.
Not bully him. Look, in a sense, the seventh day of bombing is really in response to a bunch of crazy people who thought they could bully Trump into something, right? And they're learning the hard way. And I think you can't do that. And I think they're going to pay a high price.
I think the Iranians were listening to Democrats in this country, and they got badly misled about the president, because the Democrats were like, oh, you're doing this in an election year. And they thought that Trump was going to flinch because it's an election year. You're not dealing with a normal politician. This is an entirely different beast.
Speaking of Democrats, though, on this subject, Tommy, it's the Democrats. Half of the Democrats in the House of Representatives just voted against aid to Israel. All right, that party, which used to be a great defender of Israel and Jewish, led by Chuck Schumer, the leading Jewish office holder. So in a sense, in an odd way, I don't think Vance probably wanted this to connect, but while Vance is out there making these statements, here's the Democratic Party showing its anti-Semitic bona fides. And then, of course, you have the crazies like Mondami. Most of the Democratic Socialists of America are motivated by anti-Semitism. You can see it. They talk about it openly. It's in their platform. I know they want to nationalize the economy, and they want everything to be free, and they want to tax rich people and so forth. But you know what? Culturally, it's about anti-Semitism. It's about Jews. And my point is a simple point. Bigotry and hate will spread. We've been through this before. I mean, blacks will get next, Catholics, who knows who will be next. I mean, JD should be as far away from that as possible.
There are parts of the left, and I would say growing parts of the left, who are anti-Semitic and hate Israel. And they're pretty open about it. And they've got top podcasters on their side, like Hassan Piker and others, that are very forthright about that, including their own candidates that are running and winning primaries. But there is a segment of the far right. And I would say far right, fringe right. I don't consider them right. But there's a portion who they have much of the same narrative surrounding Israel.
We know who it is. We know who you're talking about.
And it's more than one. And that's the disturbing part. There are folks in the podcast world that Charlie doesn't listen to anymore, and I don't either, but I'm aware of, who have much the same message. And, I'll see it in my own comments. If I make a comment about Iran or whatever, and I'm the most kind of anti-war person, America first person that there is, but people will say, you're captured by Israel, AIPAC is paying you off. That has become a go-to narrative for some on the right as well, and it doesn't help when our vice president plays into it even in the slightest bit. That Joe Rogan podcast was a huge misstep, and I hope he realizes that.
Yeah, I'm with you. Caroline, I want us to spend another minute or two. Producers are yelling at me, as they always do. I want to spend another minute or two. I wanted President Trump last night to tell the American people about the last phases, the stepped-up bombing that will destroy the crazies running Iran. I wanted him to speak to the American people and make sure they understood why Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, okay? And I would have also liked him to have a little add-on about my Goldilocks economy, which is doing extremely well, right? Goldilocks is back, 2.0. This, I think, is 3.0. I mean, for me, it's about 12.0. But I'm just saying, if you could have spoken to the American people about Iran and on success of the economy and his policies would have made me much happier.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why the reception to prosecuting this war had so much mixed opinion in the beginning is because the administration didn't really articulate the why very well. I would call it slightly schizophrenic explanations. I think now it's pretty clear that you cannot negotiate, you cannot reason with this tyrannical terrorist regime, the world's greatest sponsor of terror, and obviously neutering them was, of great importance to geopolitics, to United States security, and also to our greatest ally in the region. But yeah, I think there needs to be a little bit more explanation at every phase of the war, why we are doing this, and why you cannot capitulate. I know JD Vance, he represents this part of the right that is in the name of America first, I will say. That is the cover story, is this is America first. Foreign policy restraint, non-interventionism. I mean, didn't the founding fathers, didn't George Washington in his farewell address, didn't he warn against entanglements? That's the logic they use to justify the way they think. But you cannot deal with an actor like Iran in a soft way.
And don't forget, by the way, Thomas Jefferson went out and bashed the Barbary pilots. He did. He bashed those pirates, okay? Which is kind of a little bit what we're doing now. Charlie, you've met Goldilocks, haven't you, down through the years? You know what I'm talking about. This is Goldilocks 3.0. This is high-tech Goldilocks. This is supply-side Goldilocks. I just want people in the White House to talk about it. You know what I mean? If you get it right one time in a row, get it out there. Yeah. There's an election in 4 or 5 months.
Do you think President Trump will get credit for salvaging this economy as well as the economy he salvaged up until 2020 when everything got shut down?
Right, I've lived through this.
I worry that the media is not going to give him credit, but we can all certainly give him credit. Can I make one last point about the anti-Semitism in particular in the DSA, Democrat, Socialist, whatever, that has taken over the Democrat Party? If you want to know the absolute proof of how serious the anti-Semitism is there, Brad Lander, running here in New York, beat Dan Goldman, one of the most odious members to ever sit in Congress, so I was glad he beat him. But when Brad Lander first started running, he said that he would not associate with the DSA because they're so anti-Semitic, they celebrated the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel.
He being Jewish.
He being Jewish. Fast forward to today, he now campaigns with these people he accused of celebrating the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. That tells you all you need to know how spineless these people are. It is truly despicable.
Look, I've said time and time again, I've known Chuck Schumer for so long, okay? I mean, so long. We disagree on politics, I get that. But for Chuck Schumer to not stand up against the anti-Semitism of these young socialist whippersnappers I don't understand it. I just don't understand it.
What is President Trump?
Senator from Palestine. I know.
Chuck Schumer,
that's what
Democrat Palestine.
Democrat Palestine. I mean, there's things going on in the world I don't understand, but my panel was fabulous. I want to thank all of you for helping out on Friday.
Thank you.
Charlie Hurt, Caroline Downey, Tommy Lahren, terrific stuff. You can catch Charlie on Fox and Friends weekends, 6 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Tommy's on Big Weekend Show every Saturday and Sunday, 5 p.m. Eastern, all on Fox News. It's all great stuff. And Caroline Downey, National Review. Hold that banner high.